Good evening. Good to see each and every one of you here. We're glad that you've come our way if you're visiting with us, and hope you'll feel free to ask questions of anything that I might say, or things that regard our congregation, or even things that relate to your own life with God and the things that you might want to address and to learn more about, and hopefully to act upon as well. I want to continue with something. It's not that you had to be here last week to pick up where we're at, but as we were talking about the topic of Moses and what had happened with him, first of all, in the beginning of his life, the things that he went through that were done to protect him and provide for him, the things that were also done to prepare him for the job he had of leading the people of Israel. And he was timid about that. It was something he was cautious about. He was an almost not really unwilling, but he was definitely a little bit not as confident as he was going to need to be. And God had provided him and told him that he was going to be with him. And that was kind of where we ended up with in that discussion. And I want to look at what happened as we turn to the conviction that was given not only to the people of Egypt and Pharaoh, but also to the people of Israel as they were needing to leave behind where they were. And while we say, well, of course they wanted to leave behind, they were in bondage. They were being mistreated. They were slaves. They were being used in many ways, used and abused. And so when we think about them leaving Egypt, it was something that was an answer to the prayers that had been offered, a reminder of God's care for them when he brought them forth out of Egypt. But it's not too long after that they were looking back and thinking, oh, we wish we were back there. Because there was a difficult journey ahead. There was them wandering in the wilderness, which ended up being much longer than it should have been. When I say should have been, had they trusted God, it would have been a relatively short time in the wilderness. Instead, it ended up being the 40 years because of their failure to trust God to take them and provide for them in taking the land of Canaan, and being afraid of the people that were there. And it's somewhat of a very sad tale as we think about the way in which here they had this provision made for them, the answer to the promise that had been made over 400 years before, that they would be given this land. And here they had it in their grasp. And it's a very sad thing that these people who had lived their lives in bondage in Egypt end up dying in the wilderness. Those that were over 20 years old died in the wilderness because of their failure to trust God. But some of that also should have been as their confidence to trust God should not have only been in the faith that they had in God, but even the way that he had demonstrated this in the plagues that happened. So I want us to take a little bit of time and talk about these plagues. We're not going to go into great detail about it, but I want to think about not just that they happened, and they did happen. This is not a fable. This is not an allegory. This is not a parable. This is a reality. It really did happen. But also the why it happened. That it had to do with preparing them, and where they could indeed trust in God and his provisions for them. I want to begin in Exodus, the 6th chapter. If you don't have your Bible, you can pick up one of the pew Bibles that's on the back of the pew in front of you and turn to page 41 as we're going to begin this. It's actually 42 is where the verse we want to look at. As God makes a prediction about this, Exodus chapter 6 and verse 28 beginning. It came to pass on the day the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I am the Lord, speak to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say to you. But Moses said before the Lord, Behold, I am of uncircumcised lips, and how shall Pharaoh heed me? So the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother shall tell Pharaoh to send the children of Israel out of his land. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not heed you, so that I may lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies, my people, the children out of Israel out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. I think it's important not only to notice that God knew what was going to happen here. He knew that Pharaoh, and when we say he's hardening Pharaoh's heart, it doesn't mean that Pharaoh no longer had any free will. It means that he knew Pharaoh's heart, and he knew the things that would prevent Pharaoh from being willing to do what he's asking him to do, but he also is letting Moses know this ahead of time. He's letting Moses know this. He's letting Aaron, the people of Israel, know this ahead of time. So it won't be any surprise. I mean, God could have obviously struck all of the Egyptians dead and the people walk out without anything, without any conflict. We also might be just kind of keeping in the back of our mind that as God is doing this, not only is it that this is by God's intent that this is happening, but it is indeed that it is that they will know, he says, and I want you to pay attention to that the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And this becomes a reputation. As this happens here and what happens to begin with and what happens at the end of this time frame with them being let go, it spreads. The word, as you can imagine, the word of this spread. It wasn't just contained in Egypt. When they go into the land of Canaan and they send the spies into Jericho, it is Hagar, I'm trying to think of the word that's used there, but the prostitute, Hagar, I'm not saying the right word, am I? Rahab is aware of this, and she mentions it as she knew that this was the God who had delivered them, had punished the Egyptians, the plagues that had come, these other things. So there's a long-term thing that God is doing here. Not just what happens with Egypt now, but the things that are going to happen in the future as they go into the land of Canaan. And, we think about the number of things that happened as you had in chapter 7, verses 8 through 12. Now, you have a progression. You have some things that are done that should be evidence of God's approval of what Moses is asking and that it is coming from God. You have initially some things that the magicians of Egypt are emulating or copying. You have things that are kind of broad in nature and that they become very much more intense as we go through these plagues that are taking place. If we begin there in chapter 7 and verse 8, it says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, show a miracle for yourselves, then you shall say to Aaron, take your rod, cast it before Pharaoh, let it become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went in to Pharaoh, and they did so, just as the Lord commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. But Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, so the magicians of Egypt. They also did in like manner with their enchantments, for every man threw down his rod, and they all became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods, and Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them as the Lord had said." Now I think, as we look at just simply what happened here, these guys come in. It's really exactly what God had predicted would happen, that Pharaoh would be hard-hearted about this. We don't know exactly how these guys did their own trick, but it was a trick in their case. It was actually the rod becoming a serpent in the case of Aaron's rod. This was something God was doing. God was bringing this about. But you know what? God knew those other guys were going to do that too, didn't he? This is the steps along the way in what's happening here that have to do with them starting to emulate what he's doing. Obviously, it was. I don't think those other magicians counted on Aaron's serpents swallowing up their serpents, but nevertheless, these are things that God knew was going to happen, and so things go a little bit further. Chapter 7 and verse 16. Again, there is the appeal made to Pharaoh. And notice that initially it's a relatively small appeal. I think I had it in my mind for a long time that the first thing they asked for was to be let go in the sense of never coming back. But the first thing they asked for is just let us go 3 days journey and worship. Verse 16, "They shall say to him, the Lord God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. But indeed until now you would not hear." So we have this provision that's made, and then you have the Nile turned to blood. Chapter 7 and verse 20. He says, we'll start with verse 19. The Lord spoke to Moses, say to Aaron, take your rod, stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their streams, over their rivers, over their ponds, over their pools of water, that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in buckets of wood and pitchers of stone. And Moses and Aaron did so, just as the Lord commanded. He lifted up the rod and struck the waters that were in the river inside of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants. And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. The fish that were in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink the water of the river. So there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine what it was like to have all the water turned to blood? I think I'd let him go right then, you know. Verse 22, the magicians did so with their enchantments. You know, I used to have a chemistry set when I was, 11 or 12 years old. And you could take these two completely clear chemicals. Don't ask me what they were. I could have probably told you when I was 11 or 12. I have no idea what they were now. But it was, you know, they tell you these little experiments you can do. And you take these two completely clear chemicals and you pour them together and it looks like blood. You know, looks like blood. It's not blood. It's just a chemical reaction that mimics that. And there's probably something along that line that the Egyptians were doing there. But you notice also in verse 23, it says Pharaoh went into his house, neither was his heart moved by this. So the Egyptians dug all around the river for water to drink because they could not drink the water of the river. And 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the river. Now this was, of course, a big part of their life was it's everybody's life, water, and of course their river that was that way. And they even worshiped a god that was of the river. And you can actually take many of these plagues and notice that there are particular attacks on the gods of Egypt, the gods that were upheld by the Egyptians. But the second thing that happens in chapter 8, verse 1, again, the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all your territory with frogs. And, you know, in fact, as it goes on from there, so the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into your house, into your bedroom, on your bed, into the houses of your servants, on your people, into your ovens, into your kneading bowls. And the frogs shall come up on you and on your people and all your servants. You know, frogs are cute little things when there's just a few of them, right? But can you imagine them everywhere? Getting in all your beds and your kitchens. It was a nasty plague. The magicians came up with some kind of thing to copy in some limited way. But this did at least convince Pharaoh that he needed to try to get him to stop this. And Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, saying, entreat the Lord, this is verse 8, that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may sacrifice to the Lord. And then they get rid of the frogs. And Pharaoh, in verse 15, when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not heed them as the Lord had said. Then, of course, the dust of the land is turned to lice. Verse 16 and 17. So the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your rod, strike the dust of the land so that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And they did so. For Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, struck the dust of the earth, and it became lice on man and beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. The Egyptians tried to copy this but failed. And there's actually no mention of the lice being removed before the next plague comes. And that may be that these ended up doubling up in that way. I'll tell you one thing. You have kids at school that get lice, you feel like you've got a plague, even if it's just one or two kids that get it. You know, and in fact, I just talk about lice and my back of my neck starts itching just thinking about lice, okay? And then, of course, there's the flies, the fourth plague. Again, chapter 8 and verse 20, the plea let my people go, that they may serve me. Or else if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants, on your people, and in your houses. Now we think about flies and, every once in a while we'll all have a fly buzzing around, or maybe there's a few, and maybe if we live near some cows, we might get some more. I think I mentioned this at some point. We had a rent house. Gina doesn't like me to tell this, but I'm going to tell it anyway. We had this rent house, and it was surrounded by cow pastures. And there was always some flies around, but one year, for some reason, this was in Carthage, Texas, and there were just unbelievable number of flies everywhere. And I got those bags that were filled with that stuff that attract them in. And I'm just filling them up with flies. I don't know what it was about that particular year, but we couldn't get rid of them even out of the house. And I finally figured out the guy that we rented the house from, he just had an open drain line running out with no P-trap, nothing else. It's just laying out there and watering the ground. And those flies were breeding and coming in through the kitchen drain. And it was horrendous. It was like you wanted to cover up. You had to cover up with a sheet at night to keep them from crawling on your face. I felt like we were in Egypt. I wanted to let somebody go. But notice also what is said there in verse 21 and 22. When he says, as we continue reading there, verse 22, he says, "In that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, in order that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land. I will make a difference between my people and the house." Excuse me, I just lost my place. "Between my people and your people, tomorrow this sign shall be." So now he does something. Imagine he's got all these swarms of flies throughout the land of Egypt, except for the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. So Pharaoh then makes an offer, and he says, "Go sacrifice to your God in the land." And Moses said, "It is not right to do so, for we would be sacrificing the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. If we sacrifice the abomination of Egyptians before their eyes, will they not stone us? We will go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he has commanded us." So they're requiring this. And then verse 32, talk about somebody who is stuck in a rut. Pharaoh hardened his heart. At that time, neither would he let the people go. Then we have the livestock killed. Chapter 9, verse 1. Again, he's saying, "Let my people go, that they may serve me. If not, the hand will be on your cattle in the field, on the horses, donkeys, camels, oxen, the livestock." And the livestock die. And notice in verse 6 it says, not only that the livestock of Egypt died, but the livestock of the children of Israel did not even one of them died. So Pharaoh is still stubborn about this. He did not let them go. Then God turns ashes to boils. Chapter 9 and verse 10. "He took ashes from the furnace, stood before Pharaoh, and he scattered them toward heaven, and they caused boils to break out in sores on man and beast. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils of the magicians, and on all the Egyptians. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not heed them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses." So you have these, even the magicians are affected, but he's still hard-hearted about this. Then we have the hail, chapter 9 and verse 13. Again, he pleads, "Let my people go." And of course, then he sends hail unlike I've ever seen. I mean, I've seen some pretty good hailstorms in Texas. My dad had a car that he had parked in the parking lot. He had some business with some other people, and they rode in a different vehicle. They came back. This was in the Dallas area. And all the glass in his car, including the side windows on both sides, was shattered completely. I mean, that's a pretty bad hailstorm. But I tell you what, it probably had nothing, it was nothing like the hailstorm. Even so, it wasn't like the hailstorm that the Egyptians were given, as we see the things that come about here. Again, this is given as that you may know. He reminds them again that you may know. Verse 14, I will send all my plagues to your very heart and on your servants, on your people, that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. All these other false gods that Pharaoh is serving and following, they're nothing like. They don't control the weather. And especially in response to what he's doing in this way. Verse 18, he tells him he's going to send hail. And of course, it's hail and it's fire. I think the reference there is lightning. It could be other things as well. But again, verse 24 and 25 of chapter 9, he says there was hail and the fire mingled with the hail, so very heavy that there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And the hail struck through the whole land of Egypt, all that was in the field, man and beast. The hail struck every herb of the field, broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel, there was no hail. So again, we have Israel exempted. God is not only showing Pharaoh who he is, but showing that these are his people that he's protecting, and this becomes beyond all of these, past these early plagues. Pharaoh seems to show some sign of repentance. Pharaoh, verse 27, sent and called for Moses, and Aaron said to them, I have sinned this time, the Lord is righteous, and my people and I are wicked. Entreat the Lord that there may be no more mighty thundering and hail, for it is enough. I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer. Verse 30, Moses recognizes what's going on. You know, I want to just remind us that sometimes people are like this, even today. When there's trouble, when I got trouble from things I'm doing that aren't right, when I've made bad decisions and there's consequences for it, then I want to change it, but then I get rid of the consequences, and now all of a sudden I'm back to the same way. That's what's happening with Pharaoh here. Now it's affecting his whole nation but verse 34 and 35, well, Moses, of course, says, verse 30, as for you and your servants, I know you will not yet fear the Lord. It ain't time yet. But in fact, he does. Verse 34, when Pharaoh saw that the rain, the hail, the thunder had ceased, okay, we got rid of the problem. He sinned yet more, and he hardened his heart and his servants. So the heart of Pharaoh was hard, neither would he let the children of Israel go as the Lord had spoken by Moses. You see what also is happening along the way here. Every time Pharaoh recants and says, I'm not going to do this, there's an opportunity for more evidence from God that this is particularly related to the request that God is making to let them go. In fact, chapter 10 and verse 1 and 2, here it is again. The Lord said to Moses, Go into Pharaoh, I've hardened his heart, the hearts of the servants, that I may show these signs of mine before him, and that you may tell in the hearing of your sons and your son's son. Did you catch that? Your children, your grandchildren, your descendants. I mean, raise your hand if you've never heard of the 10 plagues of Egypt. You know, I would say that even people that don't read the Bible like you do, most people have heard about the plagues. In fact, sometimes they'll describe some natural disaster as being like the plagues, or we're getting hit with a plague of some sort, you know. They're aware of this in this way. But he says, not just for the Egyptians, but you, your sons, your sons, your children. This is a message that can go forth. And it didn't mean that they always had to pick up the text and read it. They could tell about it. Some of them that were there could certainly tell about this, how it had happened. And then they could tell about how they'd heard it from their grandfather. And they could tell what they'd heard from their grandfather. And those stories that were passed down that would enable them to know that this was real. This was not just some made-up thing. Again, that you may know that I am the Lord. Did you notice the early parts? It's that Pharaoh would know. Now he's saying that you will know that I am the Lord. And of course, then he recants. Moses and Aaron, tell him, how long will you refuse to humble yourselves? God has said, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me, or else if you refuse to let me go tomorrow, I will bring locusts in your territory. You know, you think about where all of this is. All of these things that are happening. The hail has already destroyed many of the crops and many of the things. And the little bit that might be starting to grow back, guess what locusts do? They love that fresh growth. Verse 4 to 6, that he tells them it's going to. Pharaoh's servants are pleading with Pharaoh. In verse 7, how long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. And did you not know that Egypt is destroyed? This is killing us. So Pharaoh tries to make a compromise. He says, well, I'm just going to let the men go. I'll let the men go out there, and they can go worship God. Remember this 3 days journey initially. Pharaoh's servants, verse 8, Moses and Aaron were brought again to Pharaoh, and he said, go serve the Lord your God. Who are the ones that are going? We will go with our young, our old, our sons, our daughters, our flocks, our herds. We will go, for we must hold a feast to the Lord. He said to them, the Lord had better be with you when I let you and your little ones go. Behold, beware, evil is ahead of you. Not so. Go now, you who are men, and serve the Lord. For it is that which you desired. And they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. So he makes that offer, but he still repents again. Verse 16, as he faces these locust plague that's come on him, Pharaoh calls for Moses. I've sinned against the Lord your God, against you. Now therefore, please forgive my sin. It sounds good, right? Sounds good. Only this once, entreat the Lord your God that he may take away from me this death only. And God brings a big wind, and the locusts are blown out of there. And in verse 20, he sees the problem's gone. He doesn't let them go. The ninth plague, the darkness. So thick you could feel it. Chapter 10 and verse 21. He put a darkness over the land. This wasn't just, a cloudy day. This was that kind of darkness that you might as well be blind. You might as well be blind. You can only see because of light. If there's no light, you can't see. I mean, you say, oh, well, it's dark in my house and I can see a little bit. No, because there's a little bit of light. If there is no light, we had a man here that worked in the mine in Baghdad. He told me one time he'd take people down into that mine, deep part of the mine, and show them what real darkness is. And I had never been in a mine like that, not that kind of mine, but I did go into Carlsbad Caverns when I was a kid, and they had the lights that, you go down there, and then they say, now, you want to see what darkness is? And they turn off those lights. And I mean, it is kind of like you could feel the darkness. It seems like you could feel it. It's just it's so dark. And to be able to function in that. Notice what it says there, and it mentions that it could be felt in verse 21. They did not see one another, verse 23. They didn't even rise from his place for 3 days. They didn't get out of bed. I don't know where I'm going. It's one thing for somebody who's blind and has kind of learned to function without sight. But for people that are used to seeing, it's kind of like when you get up and you think you can find your way to somewhere in the middle of the dark, and you really can't. I had this buddy of mine, we went deer hunting one time in East Texas, and it's tall pine trees. I know people think there's no pine trees in Texas, but there's East Texas, there's lots of pines, lots of tall hardwoods and other things. And I was getting my stuff together, and I'm grabbing my flashlight because it's early in the morning, long before the sun come up. And he said, "Oh, just leave that." He said, I'm wearing my moccasins. I can feel the trail. Just follow me. Okay. We hadn't walked in there. We probably hadn't walked 100 yards. And we had no idea where we were. It was dark. Maybe the better idea would have been, let's just stay in bed, So Pharaoh offers a conditional release. All right, he says, only let your flocks and herds be kept back, and let your little ones also go with you. So he's going to go a little bit further here. But verse 27 tells us, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He would not let them go. Pharaoh said, "Get away from me, take heed to yourself, see my face no more, for in the day you see my face you shall die." Now he's kind of gotten a little more stubborn. He's threatening Moses about this. But before he leaves, Moses predicts the final plague. Beginning in chapter 11 and verse 4, he says, Moses said to the Lord, "About midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in all the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of all the animals. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, nor shall be like it again. But against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, and all the people who follow you, for that I will go. After that I will go out." Then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. So Pharaoh got his wish. He wasn't going to see Moses anymore, but he let him know what was going to happen in his final plague. And you remember, of course, the Passover, that they made the Passover feast. They were to take the lamb that was offered and the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorpost, and they were to eat the lamb and leave nothing. And this was to be a perpetual remembrance, as verse 14 tells us, and was a continual memorial, although it wasn't always kept as it should have been, but it was to remind them, not just of this particular plague and the deliverance from it, but also that God was providing deliverance for them. And of course, this is also mentioned and compared with Jesus as our Passover lamb in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. So they're struck with the plague. Chapter 12 and verse 29. Chapter 12, verse 29, "It came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, all the firstborn of the livestock." Remember what God had told Moses when he was telling him about his duty to be the one that would deliver them. That they would not only leave the land of Egypt, they would only be released from the land of Egypt, that the Egyptians were going to provide them with what they needed, their provisions. They plundered the people of Egypt, and they didn't do it by a threat under a sword, or like when an army goes in and they capture people and they overtake a place and they take the things away from them. These are the people giving them. They're giving them provisions and gold and silver and other things. But I also just want us to think about the magnitude of that. To have the firstborn die. It wasn't, there would have been some babies, but there was more grown adults that died at that point. Instantly that night. And not among the Israelites who had the blood on the doorpost. At this point, Pharaoh actually does release them. Verse 31 and 32 of chapter 12. 31. "He called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Go, serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks, your herds, if you said, Be gone, and bless me also." And the Egyptians, verse 33, urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Remember, they were to have their sandals on their feet and everything ready to go, because it was going to be right then. That's when they needed to leave, not the next day. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they asked for the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they had requested. Thus, by this way, in other words, they plundered the Egyptians. And this describes, as we go on down, that there was 600,000 plus the children. They had been in bondage for 430 years, verse 40. that reminds us the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. It came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is the night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. So as God is telling Moses to write these things down, did you ever think about that? God is having Moses record this. And Moses experienced it. He experienced all of what he's recording here. But again, back to the why. Why did he bring all these plagues on Egypt? Why did he allow it to drag out? Why didn't God just destroy the Egyptians before the release of the Israelites? He just force it in some way like that. But you see that phrase over and over again. We read it. Chapter 8, verse 10, that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. Chapter 8 and verse 22, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land. Chapter 9 and verse 14, that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. Chapter 9 and verse 29, that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. Chapter 10 and verse 2, that you may know that I am the Lord. Chapter 11 and verse 7, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel, which lets us know He knows who His people are. Chapter 7 and verse 5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. Have you ever noticed there's a little difference sometimes in the way in future times from this, that God talks about the Egyptians, who among them there were people who really did become followers of the true God of heaven. Chapter 9 and verse 16, but indeed for this purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, talking about Pharaoh, and that my name may be declared in the earth. Chapter 10 and verse 1, now the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine before him. Chapter 10 and verse 2, that you may tell in the hearing of your son and your son's sons the mighty things I have done in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. And you can find other references too, chapter 12, verse 24 to 27. And of course, even the fact that God said He's not going to listen, but it's going to be more and more of this that's going to be done in order for you to know that I am God. And both the Israelites and the Egyptians. And we find this similar phrase in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 13, where John says, these things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life, and that you may continue to believe in the name of the Son of God. And even in regard to the things that Jesus did, and the record of those things as we're reading through the Gospels, including the book of John, where John says in the latter part of the book, in chapter 20 and verse 30, and truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So I hope we realize as we think about those horrendous plagues, that it wasn't just a show. It wasn't just about a spectacle. It was a demonstration of who God is. And it's but a small thing of what God is capable of, both in providing for us as well as in recognizing that we need to not take lightly the importance of us standing right with Him. We're going to sing a song in just a moment, number 61. Are you coming to Jesus tonight? I hope that as you think about this, you'll think about your need. If there are things that we can help you with in becoming a Christian or returning to Him in any way we can help, come forward as we stand and as we sing.